I guess the academic position on when the Gospels were written was after the epistles of Paul, or at least most of them. So the epistles were written first, and that's my understanding. Do you have sort of some evidence, maybe you can shed some light on the idea of the oral tradition or the oral transmission before the Gospels were written, that we know that what was written down was necessarily what was being transmitted?
Yeah. My own personal view is that the Gospels were written much earlier than that, because I think that the book of Acts was written prior to the martyrdom of Paul in the mid-AD 60s. And there are quite a number of reasons to believe that the book of Acts was completed before the mid-AD 60s. Not only is Paul's martyrdom not mentioned, but Jesus' younger brother James' martyrdom isn't mentioned. I spoke of it tonight. It's told by Josephus how James was stoned to death by the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem in the mid-AD 60s. Now, James was the head of the Jerusalem church. And do you mean to tell me Luke wouldn't have narrated that if the book of Acts had been written after this? It seems highly improbable. And there are many other things that makes one believe that the book of Acts was written prior to this time. Now, Luke was written prior to Acts, because the Gospel of Luke is the first half of this double work, Luke-Acts. So Luke was written probably around AD 57 or so. That's exactly the same date as 1 Corinthians, well, almost exactly the same date as 1 Corinthians 15, about AD 55. So that would put Luke's Gospel at about the same date as some of the Pauline correspondence. And Mark's Gospel was used by Luke, which would put it even earlier. And so I think that the window between the events that they describe and the writing of the Gospels, in the case of Mark and Luke and probably Matthew, is very short indeed. But in any case, to answer your question, it is a gross misrepresentation when skeptics compare the oral transmission of traditions in Judaism to the child's game of telephone, where a message gets garbled and garbled until at the end it doesn't even resemble what started at the beginning. In Judaism, children were taught in elementary school, in the home, and in the synagogue to memorize faithfully massive amounts of sacred tradition and to hand these on faithfully. In an oral culture, the ability to memorize and faithfully transmit tradition was a highly developed and important and prized skill. And the disciples could be counted on to treat the teachings of Jesus with that same sort of care and concern. And indeed, one of the differences between the game of telephone and the disciples' transmission of the traditions about Jesus is that the eyewitnesses of Jesus' life and teachings were still alive. They were still around. You could go back to the person at the beginning of the telephone game and say, "What did you say?" He's still there. So that a historian like Richard Bauckham says we really shouldn't talk about oral tradition in this case. We should talk about oral history, because the original eyewitnesses are still around to be questioned. And so it's not just a matter of tradition being handed on. So I think that gives some insight, I hope at least, to why it's so important to try to recover these early sources behind the Gospels, because these drive us right back to a time very, very close to the events themselves, where we have sources that are so early that it would be highly improbable to regard these as a result of a process of legend and mythology.
Thank you very much.